Hey there, I'm Charlie Bowen, an adjunct professor here at Marshall University, and I'm here to teach you about news writing. In the catalog, it's called JMC300, and we'll cover the basics of how to write news stories. Um, I've been an adjunct here for a couple of years, and I've taught a number of different classes. This has always been my favorite. I think we learn the basics of being a reporter through the process of learning to be a news writer. In this introductory class, um, we'll cover a number of points. I want to put the whole thing in perspective. I want to put journalism in perspective, journalism today compared to maybe 50 years ago, and how what we learn here will fit into all of that. I want to tell you how the course will be organized, and we'll go over the syllabus specifically. And then at the end, you'll have your first assignment, which is probably the easiest assignment of your entire semester. I'm going to ask you to talk about yourself. I'll have a form that I'll ask you to fill out so you'll know a little bit more about you. I will tell you something about me at the end of the class, and then maybe you can fill out the form and tell me something about you so we know who we're talking to each other. Now, let's talk about where journalism is today. Maybe put this class into some sort of perspective of what you're going to learn here and how will it fit into the job market that you'll be facing. Let's start with the big question. Are we crazy to be studying journalism? I mean, isn't journalism dead? It certainly seems to be a declining business. In the past 15 years, 1 out of 5 local newspapers has closed, and the number of working journalists has been cut in half. Many communities in our country now are what we might call news deserts. There's no local community newspaper. The nearest one is maybe at a state capital miles away or in another state. So are we crazy to be studying this business? And meanwhile, we have the whole world of disappearing gatekeepers. We have fewer and fewer editors out there working. As the number of journalists go down, the number of people who are staying in the business and being those old hands, those old editors, seems to be that number is declining too. So is it crazy to go into this business? Is there a place for trained editors and writers today? Especially with the rise of the cries of fake news and citizen journalists. Well, yes, there is a place for trained journalists. For one thing, a trained journalist knows the difference between neutrality and objectivity. What do I mean by that? Well, here's an example. An example of neutrality would be this. Marshall and Miami played football this week, and Marshall said it won, and Miami said it won, and I guess we'll never know. That's neutral. Objectivity says Marshall and Miami played football this week. Marshall scored more points and won 14-7. That's objectivity. Now, another thing that trained journalists know how to do is to research inductively. I'm sure sometime in your education earlier you've learned the difference between inductive and deductive logic. Basically, the big difference between the two is that deductive reasoning starts with a conclusion and then proves it with evidence. Inductive reasoning goes the other direction. It starts with observations and builds toward a conclusion. Deductive reasoning is used often by lawyers in a courtroom, by editorial writers, by columnists, personal columnists. They are saying, here's my position and here's why I believe that. Perfectly respectable way to approach information. Inductive logic starts with what you're observing in front of you and builds on that to a conclusion. Inductive logic is used by detectives, by scientists, and by good reporters. Something else that's special about the two differences. Deductive logic doesn't really give you new information. It says, this is what I believe, and here's why. Inductive reasoning almost always leads to new information. I have a really good example of how good journalists use inductive reasoning. Think back 3 years. There was a horrible event in Charlottesville, Virginia. You may remember a huge rally of white supremacists all through the city of Charlottesville. And the whole thing turned even worse on a Saturday afternoon when a man drove a Dodge Charger into a crowd of counter-protesters. One woman was killed and 19 others were injured. 500 miles away in Toledo, Ohio, it was a quiet afternoon in the newsroom, and a copy editor by the name of Tommy Gallagher was working on the photo desk. He was going through pictures that were coming in from the wire services from that protest and from the event with the car. And he noticed something, that the car that was driving into the crowd had Ohio license plates. By blowing up the image on his computer, Gallagher discovered a registration tag that bore the number 48. He knew that registration number 48 meant that the car was registered in Lucas County, which is where his town, Toledo, was. Now, Gallagher didn't jump to a conclusion. He didn't assume that this driver was from Toledo, but what he knew inductively was certainly that car had been registered in Toledo. That was enough information to call his editors. People came in from all over. As I say, it was a sleepy Saturday in Toledo, and so there weren't that many people in the newsroom. But they came in when they found out that this terrible story in Charlottesville might have a local connection. Within hours, reporters and editors were scouring for more information. A source at the Department of Motor Vehicles there told them who the car was registered. For the first time, long before the authorities released the name of the suspect, the people in the Toledo Blade newsroom knew the name James Alex Fields Jr., who turned out to be the driver of the car. They even had the name of his mother, who lived in Toledo, and they were able to interview her. She had no idea her son was in Charlottesville that day, and had no idea that he was behind the wheel of the car. Over the last 3 years, the case has gone to court. James Fields has pleaded guilty. He is sentenced to more than 400 years in prison, and he's serving in West Virginia in a federal prison near Morgantown. All of that is a great example of how to use inductive reasoning. Gallagher saw the car had Ohio license plates. He blew up the picture and found the number 48. That brought a new piece of information, that the car was from Lucas County. Registration led to a name, James Fields. That name led to them to search telephone directories. They found James Fields. They found his mother. They went to interview her. All of this work led to new information, and it was all because one editor was smart enough to look closely. Okay, so we know where I come down on the "are we crazy" question. Are we crazy to study journalism? No. I think what we have to learn here is valuable, and I do believe it's ultimately marketable, although I've got to be honest with you, I don't know how it's marketable. I mean, we have declining news organizations all over the country. Anyone can see it. Do I believe that there's a future in the bigger scope of things for journalists? I absolutely do. I think what we do is vital. I just don't know what the platform's going to be, and I don't think anyone can predict. Honestly, I gave up trying to predict the future. I found out in 2016 that I was really bad at predicting the future, and I don't try anymore. But I do believe that journalism is so valuable, that objectivity and the ability to tell an honest story is so valuable that there will be a future. It will probably be on the web or some variation of the web. Who knows how you're going to get paid for it? I really don't know. But I believe it will. I believe that smart, enterprising people will figure out how to use the web for a good, solid, edited product that people will pay for. So I think it's exciting. I kind of wish I could go with you. I'm too old to take that trip, but if I were 20 years old, I would be very, very excited about the future. Okay, so what is journalism? Well, it's stories. It's really interesting to me that what journalists have always called what they write is stories. Not articles, not not papers, but stories. What we become when we are good journalists is we become good, effective, honest, accurate storytellers. And really, in this class, there will be two subjects. There will be news and how to recognize it, and writing, how to write about it. Okay, then, what is news? Well, news is what is not supposed to happen. Think about that for a minute. News is not the ordinary. News is the unordinary. News is not the ordinary. News is the unexpected. Two airlines crash into buildings, the collapse of the Twin Towers, and then unused emergency rooms. Well, all of that was unexpected. We didn't expect the airlines to run into the Twin Towers. We didn't expect the Twin Towers to collapse, and most of the people in that on September 11, 2001 died. There were very little use for emergency rooms. All of that's news. Another one. A general exchanges steamy emails with a woman who is not his wife, calling into question many things, his judgment for one. That's news. A military contractor charging $600 for a toilet seat. That's news. That's the unexpected. And of course, using this definition of news as what is not supposed to happen doesn't mean that it has to be bad news. A story from a few years back, a 7-year-old appreciating the military's help after a devastating hurricane starts a nonprofit to send care packages to soldiers overseas. That's not supposed to happen either. Or a quarterback takes the field the day after his father dies. The man who coached him in his youth and throws for nearly 400 yards, completing 4 touchdown passes. That's not supposed to happen either. Most of what happens in a given day isn't news, even if it's tweeted, blogged, posted in our ever greater information overload. A reporter is one who can wade through all this stuff and find the news, find the stories, and bring their most important aspects to the foreground. A journalist is geared toward finding things that are out of place, things that don't fit with the expectations or the normal course of life. The big point is news is the unexpected. You know, there's a word for that. It's a word for things that look out of place. It is anomaly. It's from the Greek, meaning not the same. News is the anomaly. Okay, so there are two basic kinds of storytelling that is in news writing: the event story and the enterprise story. The event story is simply what you usually think of as news writing, the coverage of the day-to-day events, covering a trial, covering a city council meeting or a planning commission meeting, a crime scene or a sports event. These are all event stories. They are very timely. They are key to something that has just happened, usually within the last 24 to 48 hours. The other kind of story is the enterprise story. This is a story not keyed to a specific event. It's actually, just as the word says, the reporter, the journalist, is enterprising this story, has looked at a situation, perhaps the situation of drug sales in a community, or the way that housing patterns have changed in a state or a community, or the way a pattern of shopping has gone on in a certain area of town. These are things that a reporter might look at and enterprise a story. The great thing about this is that learning how to do one helps you do the other. We will concentrate at the beginning of the class on event stories, how to cover breaking news. But it turns out that being able to do breaking news will make it much easier to do enterprise. Now then, I want to point out that journalism is a trade, and I believe that anyone can learn to write news. It's not an art, it's not a craft, it's certainly not a gift. You're not born with the ability. It is a learned skill. You can learn to be a journalist, you can learn to write news in a very effective way. That's what we will concentrate on here, is learning those basics. We'll focus on four things in the way we approach the stories. We'll focus first on the leads, that is the first paragraph, how to make an effective lead. Then we'll switch our attention to the organization of stories. We'll also talk about how to interview. And then we'll also feature discussions on how to handle quotes and attribution. These are the four big areas that you need to know in order to write effective news. As I'll say at the time, honestly, writing an effective lead is perhaps 60% of the story, not only because that is the first paragraph that your reader sees, but it also allows you to focus your mind on how to approach the story. It will lead to the story organization. It will lead to the quotes that you use and how you handle them. So the lead will be extraordinarily important, and we will focus on that quite a lot. Okay, enough of the general and the abstract. Let's get specific. Let's talk about how the class will be conducted day in and day out. BOM is my clever little way of saying bits from Old Man Bowen. They are little, tightly written tips on what to do, on how to write effective leads, on how to handle quotes effectively. There'll be about a dozen of them, I think, before it's over. Many of my students like to hold on to them after they leave the class. They're just as good reminders of good practices in news writing. So we'll start having those as early as a week from today. Okay, I'd like to finish up this lecture by getting to know a little bit about each of you. I'm sending you a form that I'd like you to fill out. It asks for some basic information and a few of your interests and hobbies as well as your aspirations. I suppose it's also fair that you should know a little bit more about the guy doing all the talking here, so let me tell you a little bit about me. I've been involved in journalism in one way or another for the last 50 years. I got my first job when I was still a student at the University of Kentucky in Lexington. I became a part-time correspondent with the Associated Press. Here's my first press card. I'm pretty clean cut there. As Bob Dylan once said, I was so much older then. The next year I married a fellow journalist, Pamela Irwin, who had just graduated from Marshall University School of Journalism. Pamela was a writer and an editor for the Parthenon when she was a student here. Our careers would intertwine for the next 50 years and still do. We just celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary. After our wedding, Pamela moved to Kentucky with me as I finished my work on my degree at UK. While we were in Lexington, she got a job with the Lexington Leader, the afternoon paper, covering courts and the education beat. I went back to my part-time job with the AP and worked there until my graduation. Then we moved back to this area. In 1971, we both went to work for the Huntington Publishing Company, working for the old Huntington Advertiser, the afternoon newspaper, as reporters initially. We even had desks right across from each other. Over the next few years, we both got promotions. Pamela became news editor. I became city editor, a job I would hold for the next 8 years. Pamela continued working for the Huntington newspapers until 2001. I left in 1985 to try something new. I wanted to become a freelance writer, so the time was right for me to write books on a new interest of mine. I'd become very interested in personal computers, and I got an opportunity with my old friend Dave Payton to start writing books in the new field of communications through personal computers. We wrote about information services like CompuServe and The Source and Dow Jones News Retrieval and America Online, none of which I think is around anymore because the web ate everybody's lunch. But in the 1980s and early 90s, it was a pretty good business to be in. I did that for about a decade, writing books. I also wrote columns for computer magazines. I was a contributing editor to one of the magazines. I was a columnist for another of the magazines. In the 1990s, I tried something else new. Jameson Broadcast, a company in Washington, D.C., asked me to become the researcher and the online talent, as they called it, for a radio series called The Internet News. In those days, the web was so new. This was 1994, I think. The web was so new that people were always looking for things on the web. So this was a drive time radio show that allowed people to learn about a different new website every day. And that show lasted for 6 years. It was even carried by the Voice of America at one point. We had several thousand stations across the country. About the time I started thinking about retirement, Marshall came along and said, "Would you like to teach?" Well, I'd always wanted to teach. Editors are, certainly city editors, where I spent most of my Huntington newspaper career. Editors are a form of teacher. And the Huntington papers were entry-level newspapers, which meant we had a lot of young reporters just starting out working for us. So teaching was a natural instinct for me, and I have loved the last, it's been almost 6 years now that I've been doing classes like this as an adjunct. And so I'm still doing journalism. I'm still working with the tools that I learned with Bob Cooper at AP in 1968 and 69. So that's my story. Now do me a favor and take a moment to fill out the form that I sent you, the one called Tell Me About Yourself. Okay, it has 15 questions. That doesn't mean you have to fill them all out. The basic stuff's easy: name, nickname, email address, hometown. I'm asking, I'm being nosy is what I'm being. I'm asking for your favorite subjects, for recent books you've read, favorite authors and movie directors. If any of these questions don't seem applicable to you, or frankly don't want to tell me, just leave them blank. I would ask you to pay a particular attention to the last part. The last question says, finally, in several paragraphs, answer this question: why am I here? Why am I studying journalism? Write about whatever the question means to you. You can talk about what has attracted you to this subject, or who inspired you to pursue this career, or what you hope to accomplish. It's your call as to how you approach that answer. So just answer it the way you think it's intended, or the way you wish it were intended.